Hey everyone, it's so exciting to see so many of you here to learn about wild edibles. I'm going to specifically be talking about trees, and we're going to be basing our conversation on local to New Brunswick, although these trees can be found in most places. But I wanted to focus on trees that were local to New Brunswick, as well as abundant, and ones that you hopefully will be able to easily identify. So let's get started. So the first thing I want to mention is ethical harvesting. So we need to focus on that before we move into actually harvesting. There's just some things that you need to keep in mind when you start your foraging harvesting adventures. So the first thing we want to remember is that we need to identify our plant. So we want to make sure that we're positively, without a doubt, knowing that the plant that we are harvesting is what we think it is. So obviously listening to this webinar today is going to help you to identify some plants. And then there are some other resources as well. So of course, it might be easy to think that you could just go online and Google different plant. However, I will advise you that that may not be the best option. Of course, we can maybe double check some of our resources there, but it's actually not the best place to try and identify plants. I've typed in many a time plant that I kind of knew what it was or what it looked like, and when I found it on Google, yes, there are some pictures that are that plant, but then there's quite a few others that I can say, okay, that is definitely not the plant I'm looking for. However, it's labeled as the particular plant. So even dandelion. We know what dandelion looks like, but there are some lookalikes, and sometimes if you type dandelion into Google, it will bring up pictures of another flower that looks very similar. There's hawkweed that has a yellow flower, kind of looks similar. So that being said, first thing you may want to do if you're really interested in foraging is buy an identification book, plant ID book. So there are one specific to New Brunswick. There's one, a wildflowers in New Brunswick. It's by Todd Boland. And then there's edible plants in Atlantic Canada. That's another great book. And then there's some field guides. So there's Newcomb's Wildflower Guide. There's a Peterson's Guide. There's a Trees and Shrubs of the Maritimes. That one's also by Todd Boland. So I definitely recommend checking out some books. And if you can find ones local to your area, that's always going to be best. And then obviously taking webinars like this one, where we talk about the plants and show you pictures to help identify, getting to know your local forager or your local herbalist or botanist who is often out in the fields working. They will be able to help you as well. In New Brunswick, you have the Herbalist Association of New Brunswick. So that's a good resource. You can go to the website and find, herbalists in your area. And then they also, send out newsletters talking about the plants. So that's another resource as well. And then of course we can put Google last on our list. So once we positively identify the plant, we want to also think about sustainability. So we want to harvest in areas where the plant or the tree is in abundance, and you never want to harvest more than you can use. So if you're going out and looking for, let's just use tamarack as an example. That's the tree actually that's in this picture here. And if you only found one, and we typically harvest the needles from the tamarack, if you only found one or two and you had planned to harvest a lot of needles and the trees were relatively small, probably not the best place to start harvesting from. You want to really look for, bigger trees, at least 5 or 6 of them in the area, let's say. So you just want to make sure that you're harvesting sustainably so that the plant can continue to reproduce and provide for many years. We never want to just clear out an area, even though you may get really excited because you found the plant that maybe you've been on the hunt for. But if there's only a few in that area, you really, want to leave it alone. And then when we talk about never harvesting more than you can use, again, when we get harvesting or excited about harvesting and foraging, and we find a spot that maybe it has an abundance of the particular plant you're looking for. So you may think, oh wow, I'm just going to harvest so much of this plant and take it home, and I have so many uses for it. And then when you get it home, you realize, say you make a few things with it, you realize you still have a large amount left over, and what are you going to do with this? And then oftentimes it'll end up, going to waste. So we really want to make sure that you kind of have an idea of how much you need or how much you're going to harvest. And maybe if the first time that you're foraging that particular plant, you just harvest a small amount, and then you can see, how much of that plant you use to make your particular preparation. Or maybe you just dried it for tea, and then, next time you can harvest more. We just don't want to harvest more than we can use because we want to make sure that the plants are really sustainable and we're not just over harvesting, because that can lead to having at-risk species where plants have become popular And because of that, people just go out and harvest them like crazy. And then that plant doesn't have a chance to reproduce. And now we're at risk of losing that species. So there's a website called United Plant Savers where you can check to see if there is a particular plant that you're interested in harvesting that is at risk. So for example, like echinacea is one of those plants because it did used to grow wild, in lots of different areas. But again, because it became so popular, people started harvesting it and it wasn't able to reproduce as much. So now we need to plant it in order to have it to make medicinal preparations from it. Ginseng is another one. You will want to take that list with a little bit of a grain of salt because there are plants on there that in certain areas they might be at risk, but they may not be in our area. So like eyebright is a good example. In my land in particular, where we have our gardens, there's lots and lots and lots of eyebright, like an abundance of eyebright. So I would never think that it was at risk because we just have so much of it. But when you go to the at-risk plant savers list, it is listed there because in other areas of the country, so United Plant Savers typically covers North America. So, places in the US or places in the West may not have as much eyebright. So that's why they have it on the at-risk plant list. So you just, be mindful. Obviously, if you see with your eyes in the area that you're in that there is an abundance, then it may be okay to harvest, but you may want to do a little bit more research to just figure out how that plant reproduces. And if you take all of it or a large portion, will it come back? Because there are some, especially woodland plant, that take, 7 years to even germinate or to grow any sort of root. So just want to keep that in mind. And then I wanted to put a few questions in that we should be thinking about before we start harvesting. So is this plant an endangered species? Like I just mentioned, how does it reproduce? How can you make the least negative impact on this plant and the ecosystem? Is there a way to propagate the roots to keep the plant alive? How can you spread the seeds so they will germinate well? And how can you positively impact this plant and the ecosystem? So all things to just keep in mind when you start foraging and harvesting of particular plants. You always want to think about how is that plant going to reproduce and how can you make the least negative impact on the plant and the whole ecosystem, because that ecosystem is relying on that plant. Since we're talking about trees, I thought it would be good to just talk a little bit about ethical harvesting in regards to that. So sometimes with trees, we want to harvest the bark. We want to harvest it in the spring when the sap is flowing through the inner cabium. And the inner cabium is the inner bark, so that's what we're going to use typically for medicine. But we also want to keep in mind that we're using that part of the tree for the medicine because that sap flowing through is full of lots of nutrients and it's sending up all the goodness up to the top of the tree to produce the leaves and the flowers and the fruit. So that's, a lot of the chemical constituents that we would use to make medicine. Herbal medicine is in that inner bark. So we don't want to harvest it in a way that's going to affect the actual health of the tree. So as you can see in this picture, they're taking that nice vertical strip from a tree. So you can do that, that's fine. You never want to go the whole way around the tree and take all that bark off, because again, then we would be removing the transport system basically of those nutrients going from the roots up to the top of the tree. So if you take bark off the whole way around, horizontally around the trunk, the tree will die. So we want to be mindful of that. Never harvest the whole way around the tree, but you can do it a vertical strip. But it's not the best method because it's not going to kill the tree, but it can open the tree up to infection. So a better way would be to find a recently fallen tree or branches that have fallen off the tree. And we want to hopefully get them very soon after they've fallen off, just because that's where there's going to be a lot more medicinal properties. Whereas if it's fallen off and been there for, 6 months, it's probably not very much happening in that branch anymore that we would want to use for medicinal purposes or edible purposes. So we can also prune our branches and harvest the bark from the branches that you're pruning. You just want to, keep in mind that this tree is a living being and we want to harvest from it in the most ethical way possible so that it continues to grow and live so that we can continue to harvest from it. So just doing the least amount of damage as possible. So yeah, it's good if we can harvest from branches and things that have already fallen, but obviously that's not going to always be the case. We just have to try and find the best way we can to harvest while respecting the tree. Also keep in mind that if you're harvesting the buds of a tree, you're removing the leaves and the flowers. So those buds contain the leaves and eventually the flowers. So if you're harvesting, say, balsam poplar buds, well, that tree is not going to have as many leaves as it would if you didn't, obviously. So don't just, take all of those buds off the tree. We need to leave some there. And then if you're harvesting flowers from a tree, so say hawthorn, for example, the flowers have like really great properties for your heart. So if you harvest those flowers just to make something with, you're not going to get the fruit that appears on the hawthorn after, well, it doesn't just appear, but grows from those flowers. So again, just keep that in mind too. If you want to use some of the fruit from a tree, don't harvest all the flowers because then you're obviously not going to get any. And then the last thing I just wanted to say about ethical harvesting is really just a little word to the wise. Nature provides enough for us all to harmoniously live off the land. However, if we are wildcrafting and harvesting, it is our responsibility to be stewards of the land to ensure the animals, creatures, and ecosystems can continue to thrive. All right, about pine. You can take the bark and boil it to make a tea, or you could also grind it and enjoy it as a tea as well, or you can also add it to your soups and stews. And then you can make an infusion or a tea, they're the same, made with the needles. And those are going to provide you with vitamin C as well as beta carotene. So if you were just today, after this webinar, decide, oh, well, I want to go harvest some pine needles, and you have a pine tree, you can just go gather some of the needles. If you wanted to make a bit of a stronger infusion, you could use a half a cup of the needles. You want to crush them a little bit just to get that cell walls open. And then you can add them to a pot of simmering water, let it simmer for about 15 or 20 minutes. What I find easiest is just going to grab those needles, break them up a little bit with your hands, put them in a mug, pour some boiling water over them, and then let them steep for 10 minutes. And then you can discard the needles, strain them out, and just enjoy that nice tea. So it's nice to have that during these winter months. You can also take the pine bark and make a flour with it. So that's pretty cool. And then you can, make crackers, or you can substitute for other flour as well. That's a little bit laborious, but they're pretty tasty, pretty fun to do. All right, so this is on the Bare Roots Forest website, on the education website. You'll get this presentation, so you'll have the link. So I'm not gonna go through everything, but I just wanted to show you how easy it is to make some pine needle vinegar. And vinegar extracts vitamins and minerals from plants. So this is going to extract lots of the vitamin C and lots of the vitamin A. Of course, apple cider vinegar has lots of benefits as well. And then you can use this vinegar any way that you would typically use vinegar. So basically, in this first picture, we're finding a fallen down branch, because that's the best way to collect our trees is if they've fallen, because they're basically giving themselves to us anyway. We take our needles, put them on a little chopping block there. We chop them up nice and fine, or not even, just as long as you chop them up a little bit. Then we're going to put them in a jar. Very simple. Just fill the jar up as much as you can fit in there. We're going to pour our vinegar into the jar right up to the top. Then you're going to give it a little stir, and then you're going to put your lid on. So typically with vinegar, we want to put parchment paper before we put the lid on, because otherwise the metal will erode and it could get in the vinegar, and that's not good for our wonderful creation. So we want to put a little parchment paper there, put the lid on, and then we let it sit. I like to let it sit for 4 weeks, but if you're really craving that pine needle vinegar, you could strain it within 2 weeks, and then you can start using it in any way that you see fit. You can add it to your greens. You can put it in your salad dressings. If you make salad dressings, you could just put it on different things. Some people just take shots of their herbal vinegars. So lots of different ways that we can use our vinegar, and it is that simple to make. Very simple. So not only can you go out and collect some pine to have a nice tea, but you can also make some vinegar from the pine, and we can do that right now. All right, one other thing to mention about pine is the pine pollen. So some of us may dread pollen season, all that beautiful yellow pollen floating through the air, causing allergies, but we actually should probably appreciate the pine pollen a little bit more than we do. So in a pine forest, within the 2 to 3 week span that the pollen is there, it can create 100 million, now that's a large number, 100 million tons of pollen, and that just blankets the forest that it's in, obviously. And I like to think it's providing all these nutrients to the plants so they can really grow nice and healthy throughout the spring and summer, because pine pollen has all these amazing vitamins and minerals. So you can see here, it has vitamins A, B, all kinds of Bs, D, and E. And then tons of minerals, so calcium, copper, iron, manganese, magnesium, the list goes on. It also has over 20 amino acids and all 8 essential amino acids, so it's basically a complete protein. And then it also contains essential fatty acids, antioxidants, resveratrol, flavonoids, again, and some building blocks of testosterone, so androgens. So much is in this pine pollen. It's basically like, they call things superfoods. This would be like a nutrient-dense superfood for us here in Canada, well, North America. So you're looking at that thinking, whoa, this is awesome. There's so many great things in pine pollen. How can I collect it? How do I get it? So that tends to be the trickier part because you can see there from the picture that it grows on those little catkins. And sometimes it can be a little hard to harvest a large amount. So I like to either take a paper bag and just put it over each of those little catkin sections and kind of shake it into the bag. You could also cut them off of the tree and then lay them out on parchment paper, let them dry, because I find when you let them dry, it kind of produces some more of the pollen will come out. And then you kind of shake them and then put the pollen in. It'll lay out on the parchment paper. And then you can just put it in a container. But you can also take those and put them in a vinegar. So make a vinegar like I just discussed. There's also another way you can put them in honey. So this picture at the bottom in the jar, that's the pine pollen catkins in honey. And so that makes like a fermented honey syrup with all that good pine pollen benefits. And if you're lucky enough to get a nice jar, like in the top picture, the pollen, then you can use that to just sprinkle on, say if you have oatmeal in the morning or yogurt or anywhere you see fit, you can just sprinkle on pine pollen. You can put it in your smoothies, that kind of thing. So it is amazing, but again, it is kind of hard to harvest sometimes. It takes a lot of patience. So some other benefits besides all those vitamins, minerals of the pine pollen is that it restores our hormone levels. This is typically will happen if you're taking the tincture. So that's where you take the catkins and put them in alcohol and extract the properties there. Some of the properties in the pine pollen can only be extracted into alcohol. So if you're having issues with your hormone levels, you'd want to look into getting the tincture or making the tincture of pine pollen. Because it has all those B vitamins, it's going to help soothe our nervous system. It's going to help regulate and strengthen our immune system, reduces cholesterol. And you can see the list goes on and on there. So again, pine pollen is definitely one of our, up here in the north, our superfood, so nutrient dense, so amazing. All right, so we're going to talk quickly about birch. There's a few different kinds of birch. There's yellow, paper, and gray, more as well. Those are the main ones here. We can use the bark, the buds, the catkins, the leaves, and the sap. So the sap we would harvest in early spring, and then the leaves when they open. So when we move into late spring, early summer, when we can harvest the birch leaves, we could also infuse those in apple cider vinegar. We want to leave them for about a month or so in our jar, and they're going to make an excellent nutritive tonic, which is going to be rich in vitamins, minerals, and the benefits would be it's bone building, strengthening to the immune system. And again, vinegars are pretty versatile, so you can add them to your salad dressings. You can also put a tablespoon of this vinegar in water, and it works as a quick pick-me-up, and it can also help to relieve a headache. So the awesome thing that I want to mention about the birch is really the sap. And we have about, I don't know, probably 6 to 8 weeks before the sap starts flowing. It's usually, I find, depending on our winter, a week, 2 weeks after the maple sap is done flowing, then we can expect to have the birch sap flowing. And you just tap the tree as you would a maple tree. You can see a tiny little picture there of someone this is not me tapping it like that. I just use normal, buckets and taps that you would to collect maple sap, but you can do it anyway, any which way. Again, just be mindful that you're doing it ethically, but you do it the same way as you would maple sap. And then you have this amazing sap that has a very similar chemical profile as coconut water. So I'm sure many of you have drank coconut water in the past for different reasons, and instead you could be drinking some birch sap. There's a list of things that it has that are beneficial for us. So saponins, phytohormones, sugars, vitamin C, amino acids, proteins, lots of different minerals, magnesium, zinc, potassium, and then some different enzymes. So lots of amazing benefits from the birch sap. So if you decide that you want to collect some sap, you can obviously drink it fresh. That's a great way to do that. You'll get a lot. So you kind of have to keep that in mind if you harvest. So when I first learned about birch sap, you get so excited to harvest these things. And if we go back to the beginning when I was talking about, just harvest what you need, well, I didn't really do that. And I tapped about 6 or 7. And I wasn't planning on making any syrup because you can also boil it down like you do maple and get some syrup. The ratio is like 100 liters to 1 liter. So it takes a long time to boil it down. But I wasn't interested in that. I just wanted the sap. So I tapped like 6 trees. And every day you get a bucketful and a bucketful of all these trees. So I ended up with a lot. I was like, what am I going to do with all this sap? I was drinking a lot of it fresh, which I will say probably not the best thing to do is to drink a lot of it. I did kind of feel like a little out of it. So it's very cleansing to the body. And then I'll show you in the next slide how we ferment it. So I was also drinking a lot of fermented birch sap. And there's a point in time where I was driving on the highway thinking, I probably shouldn't be driving because it kind of makes you a little loopy. So just a little word of advice. Don't drink too much. It could cause some little loopiness and maybe you shouldn't be driving or doing other things that require any sort of attention. Anyway, so you can drink it fresh. You can also freeze it. So what I ended up doing with a lot of it was freezing it in ice cube trays, and then I would add it to smoothies throughout the year. But then you can also ferment it. This is pretty interesting and very simple to do. You just take your jars, fill it with your sap, and then I like to add in, I was adding in some peppermint because it made it taste really good. And then I was also adding in juniper berries. You can add in other things as well, but those are the 2 that I tried, so that I'd recommend those. And then you basically just leave it there for a few days and then it's fermented. So then it's going to have like the probiotics. So it's even going to make it more beneficial nutritional wise because, the fermentation process provides us with lots of good probiotics and good bacteria. So that's a good thing to do with your birch sap as well. The fermented birch sap doesn't last forever, so you can keep it in your fridge, for a few weeks and just drink it throughout the day. But again, so if you're looking these 3 large mason jars full, like that's a lot. So even if you had a party, which we're not really allowed to do now, you wouldn't even get through all of this. So just again, keep in mind that if you're just starting out, you probably only want to tap maybe 1 or 2 trees, but it does freeze well, so you can definitely freeze it and then use it throughout the year in different ways. Last thing I'll mention about birch sap is you can also use it to make a tea. So if instead of using water, you could substitute the birch sap as well. All right, quickly, we're moving on to spruce. So there's lots of great things we can do with our spruce. There's a few different species or kinds, so it's black, red, white. I like to do, especially, food-wise with the spruce, is collect the tips. So that's the picture up in the corner is showing you what the tips look like, and you harvest those in the spring. You can kind of see in the picture there where those little brown, I like to call them jackets, are kind of at the ends. So you want to try to get them like a little bit, these are pretty good, probably a little bit earlier would be good. I like to make sure when I'm harvesting them that I take those little brown jackets off and then put them in the basket, mainly because afterwards when you get home, it just takes a lot of time to start taking those jackets off. So I've tried different ways to speed it up, and nothing that I've found has really worked in my favor of making it any quicker. So while you're doing it, just take those little jackets off. You don't want to use those for anything. The tips, really high in vitamin C, beta carotene, they have some starch and sugars. I like to eat them raw, so just when you're walking through the woods, just nibble on them. Some people like the taste, other people find that it tastes like cleaner. So I don't know, I guess if you first taste it and it tastes like cleaner, I'd say give it another try. They do kind of get better, maybe. You'll find they get tastier as you go along, but they're quite tasty. So you can also harvest them and make teas with them. My favorite way to use them is to grind them with salt. So you'll see in that other little bubble there, it kind of, hopefully you can tell that that's sea salt. So I take the spruce tips, put them in a food processor, put in some salt near the end. So I grind them up, then I put in some salt, grind it up a tiny bit more, and then just lay it out flat on a baking sheet and put it, say, on top of the fridge, or if you had a wood stove, put it on top of that and just let it dry out. So the salt really takes a lot of that nice flavor from the spruce tips, and it gives you a nice, tasty salt. You can also freeze them and then add them to soups and stews, throughout the winter or any other time. They do well in the freezer. You can also make a jelly with them. Honestly, I've made the jelly a few times, and I probably shouldn't say this, but it wasn't my favorite. But, everyone's different. So you may really enjoy it. You can also soak them in oil and make a really nice, tasty cooking oil with them, that you would make your salad dressings with the oil. Or you could put these in vinegar too, and it's going to extract all those nice vitamins and minerals. And then some people make beer from the spruce tips. I haven't done that, but obviously the spruce is going to add lots of vitamins to your beer. And here's a recipe for pickled spruce tips. I won't go through it, but again, this is something you'll have if you decide to make them. They're very tasty as well. And then elder. Here in New Brunswick, we have 2 types of elder that grow wild. So you'll see in the first picture, in the left is Sambucus racemosa, so that's a red elderberry. And then on the right side of the screen, you have Sambucus canadensis, so that's our common elderberry. So a few things I just want to mention. I'm sure you guys have all heard of elder. It's an antiviral, hyped up to be really great at taking when you have a cold or flu, which it is. It's very good. It's just, you probably have seen prepared syrup already made from large companies, but there's a reason for that. It is very effective. So it's really great at helping kind of put a coating on our cells so when viruses come in, they just kind of bounce off. So besides having lots of medicinal benefits, there's also some great nutritional benefits of the elder. The flowers are high in antioxidants, vitamin C and quercetin, and then the berries have vitamin A, C, potassium, folate, calcium, iron, flavonoids. The one thing you have to be cautious about is that the red elderberry, the berry itself, does have some kind of bad properties. So not bad, but it can cause diarrhea, vomiting. So basically we would say they're toxic. So you don't want to use the red elderberry for anything at all. However, the flower from the red elderberry is perfectly fine. So we can harvest the flower and we can make some preparations that I'll show you in the next slide. So, this kind of works out nicely because we can harvest the flower from the red elder and use it. And then if we are lucky enough to find the common elder, we don't have to use the flowers at all. So then we can get the berries from the common elder. So if we harvested the flowers from the common elder, well, of course, then we're not going to get the berries. So it kind of works out nicely that the flowers are safe for both, but we only need to harvest them from the racemosa species to use for different preparations. And then we can harvest the berries from the common elderberry to make noir syrup or other preparations. So again, just make sure that you can identify these. And obviously the color of the berries is pretty, clear. And the flowers look quite different, as you can tell there too. The other thing with the red elder is you will find the flowers are blooming like late May, and then the flowers for the common don't bloom until early July. So the flowering time is much different as well, right? So again, please make sure you are using the right elderberry when you're making any preparations. One other quick thing about the berries, even on the common elder, the seeds can cause vomiting. So you never want to dry the berries and then grind them and say add it to smoothie because you'll get that effect. So here's some really exciting recipes that you can make with the elderflower. So they have a lot of yeast. The flowers produce a lot of yeast, so you can make your very own elderflower champagne, which is awesome. Very easy to make. The recipe's there. It tastes amazing. It's like fairy juice, we call it here. And you can use, either flower, the racemosa or the canadensis to make the champagne. I highly recommend doing that if you can find the flowers because it tastes so awesome. And I don't even like drinking alcohol, but the champagne is, when you call it fairy juice, it doesn't count. And then you can make, if you're really not into making any kind of alcoholic beverage, and really the content of alcohol would be very minor, but you can make a cordial, which uses quite a bit of sugar, but it is really tasty too, and you can add it with carbonated water. It tastes awesome. And here's, a nice classic recipe for syrup, and then a chutney if you wanted to use the berries. And lastly, hawthorn, I just wanted to mention because it's very abundant here. The berries have lots of great flavonoids, vitamin C, B vitamins, and then you can use those to make jellies, cordials. Ketchup and barbecue sauce is definitely the best recipe I've ever made with the hawthorn berry, or they call them haws. So tasty. And you can identify a hawthorn. It'll have those, if you look in the right-hand picture, those nice little thorns. So, and of course, it has lots of medicinal benefits for the heart. But just be careful. If you harvest the flower, obviously you're not going to get those haws. And then high bush cranberry, also very abundant. The berries are really high in vitamin C and K, and you can use them to make jelly, syrups, or juice. I like to add the juice to applesauce when I'm making it, because obviously they're going to be very tart. They're a cranberry, but they're, very, very abundant. So you can use those for many different things. And lastly, I just want to say thank you. I know that was a lot of information, and you're more than welcome to head over to the Bare Roots Education website. And I have a virtual tree walk that you can go through. It mentions some of these trees that we talked about, a few other ones, and I go into more detail about the medicinal benefits of them. Of course, you can always reach out to me at my email, and I guess you can head over to like Facebook or Instagram and just type Bare Roots Forest and you'll find it. I'm not really very active there, but you know, I do share some things once in a while. All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Tatum. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing with us. So we will go ahead and take some time for questions now. So Kelsey asked if we just eat on the common elderberries? Can we eat them? We have to cook, right?
Yeah, you don't want to just pick them off the tree. Well, especially the red ones. We definitely want to stay away from those. You don't want to just take the berries and eat them again because that seed can produce some bad effects, so vomiting, things like that. So we definitely don't want to eat them raw at all. They definitely should be prepared in some, whether it's a syrup, drying them and then making the syrup, drying them and adding them to a tea blend or something. But yeah, never consume them raw.
Great. Tabia wants to know if we can use both apple cider vinegar and white vinegar for the pine vinegar.
Right. Yeah. So we typically would use apple cider vinegar, not plain white vinegar, just because it has a lot more medicinal properties, nutritional properties. So we try to want to stick with the apple cider vinegar. Although with spruce tips, I sometimes use a white vinegar just because it's kind of called poor person's balsamic vinegar, and you really notice the taste more if you're using a more neutral vinegar rather with the apple cider vinegar. I mean, I've tried both, and some people will say to use pasteurized apple cider vinegar, and of course others say non-pasteurized because you don't want to kill all the benefits. But then some people, the reason why they say use pasteurized is because, you know, there could be certain bacteria on the plant that interacts with bacteria in the apple cider vinegar that could cause some issues. So again, that, you know, I would do more research about that if you're concerned, but there are two sides. Some people say use pasteurized apple cider vinegar, others say raw.
Thanks, Tatum. Tabia is also asking, what season do we find pine pollen?
So it'll be mid-June-ish, I would say. You really have to be watching. I found, especially because our seasons seem to be, you know, sometimes things are early, sometimes they're late, sometimes who knows? So if you have a pine tree close to you, you can just kind of tap the tree. And if you see yellow, or if the wind blows and you start seeing yellow pollen, or usually it'll land on your car or other areas, as soon as you see the yellow dust flying, then you know it's time. But keep an eye out starting in June, I would say.
Great. And for pine pollen, can we consume it if we are allergic to pollen in general?
I can only really speak for myself because I do have allergies, like pollen allergies, quite a bit, or I get really stuffed up, and I do consume the pollen, and I actually find it kind of helps me deal with my pollen allergy a little bit better. That's me speaking from my own experience.
Okay. And is it possible to substitute stevia or maple syrup for the sugar in the elderberry cordial?
You could. It wouldn't work as good as a preservative because the sugar is there to, well, obviously it makes it taste better, but really when we use honey and sugar, it's also acting as a preservative, so it lasts longer. So okay. I'm not sure that the stevia would have that same benefit.
Okay. And how long do pine needles last after harvesting?
That's a good question. I think that they don't last that long. So if you're going to harvest them, you'd probably want to use them within a month or so. I don't know. I've never really kind of dried them because they're just always there fresh. So I guess I don't really have the best answer for that one. If you have access to a pine tree, then I would just probably harvest, you know, what you'd use within the week and then continue harvesting rather than trying to. And it's going to depend on the environment that you're storing them in. And
okay. And do you recommend freezing the spruce tips to preserve?
Yep, that's a good way to preserve them.
And pine syrup, does it have a low glycemic index?
Well, if you're adding, I guess it depends what kind of sweetener you're adding. So if you're adding sugar, really that's all in the preparation. You're going to use as your sweetener.
Someone's asking, can we eat seeds of the elderberry when cooked or dried?
No.
Can you talk about uses for service berries?
Yes, I was going to put them in the presentation, but then I figured I didn't have time. So service berries, they have nice white flower, and they're usually early on in the spring. And then obviously the berries are there later on, but you can use those to make jellies, jams. If I'm correct, and I could be wrong, But, people that were here a long time ago, relying on the land, they would collect the service berries and put them in their pemmican, make bread with them, things like that. So yes, you can just nibble on those ones too.
And Sophie's asking, what is your recommendation when you live in an urban area? Can your harvest be contaminated from acid rain and just general pollution from an urban setting?
Well, yeah. So we just want to be mindful of where we're harvesting things from. And some plants definitely absorb toxins much easier than others. So, trees typically are fine, I guess, in an urban setting. But yeah, it does become a little bit more challenging to harvest things because they will definitely absorb some of those pollutants. I don't know if that's really answering the question, but just be mindful, I guess, of where you're harvesting from.
Okay.
Thanks, Tatum. Can you talk about uses for tamarack?
So that's the picture here, or the tree here, just in early spring. So tamarack also has, in those little needles, has lots of vitamin C. I like to just pick them and eat them, but you could do the same as you do spruce tips, pick them, freeze them. You can pick them, make a nice tea with them. I find that when you dry them, they turn a little bit sweeter and make a really nice tea. So very similar to the spruce tips. So you could use them in the same kind of manner.
Great. And then the last one would be Tabia's asking, is there an app or website for local foragers? I assume your website would be a good place, and Genevieve's website.
Yeah, I don't know of any app. I know there's like plant apps. I haven't used any, and I know, anyway, someone came to our land and was using one, and every time it came up wrong. So I guess I would just be careful of that. Definitely go for books, and maybe what I'll do is put together a little, and me and Geneviève maybe can do together a little list of books that we rely on to identify plants, and we can get that sent out to everybody. That's probably
awesome. Okay, I think we should be ready now to move on to the next presentation.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tatum. It was a pleasure having you today. Our second speaker is Geneviève Losier. She's an herbalist, forager, and has been teaching through wild food and medicine walks since 2014. Welcome, Geneviève.
Hi. There you go. Okay, so I'm Geneviève Losier. I'm a forager and wild food expert, and I wanted to talk to you guys about really, really abundant plants and invasive plants that we can eat that are free and growing wild, so we don't have too much worry about eating too much. So just a little quick backstory. When I started foraging, I was really young. My grandfather used to take us out for mushroom picking and for berries and things like that. And I got into just being outside and relaxing and, being outdoors with my family. We did a lot of camping, hiking, canoeing, fishing. And when I got in my teens, I let all of that go, kind of thing. And quite a few years ago, this is when the whole foraging really took center stage in my life. We went through a really hard time financially. I lost a job and things like that. And it put us on a path of being more self-reliant, being more self-sufficient, and really buckling down and being more resourceful. So for us, it was, I'm a mother of three, so we wanted really good foods for our kids. And we wanted to eat well, even if money was tight. So when you go through a really big event like that in your life, like they say, the only way is through. And I'm so glad we actually went through that, because I learned so much. So for us, it was very important to teach our kids how to be more self-reliant in the wild. And that includes, fishing, hunting, foraging. So that was my little story about how we got into foraging, and we made it a challenge to actually harvest as much as we could wild and free, and then make unique recipes with them so that our kids would still be engaged and be like, not another salad, or not another, steamed wild vegetable kind of thing. So we'll go through the recipes later, or just examples of the types of wild foods that we eat. But we'll start with 6 plants that are fairly easy to recognize and harvest. and what to do with them. So everybody pretty much knows fiddleheads. So fiddleheads is very prolific in the Maritimes, especially. When I was back in Ontario, there wasn't something that we really picked as much. So fiddleheads, it's one of the first wild edibles available in the spring, and harvesting lasts about 3 weeks, 4 weeks. When the black flies start really coming out, you know that the end of fiddlehead season is near, you know. And they're really high in omega-3 fatty acids and antioxidants, and actually twice as much as blueberries. And blueberries is one of the best superfoods for antioxidants. So this was really interesting for us to find out. High in fiber, vitamins A and C. And they're easy to spot and easy to pick, but I would recommend that you only pick 2 to 3 fronds per plant. The plant can keep producing. So let's not cut the whole thing. And let's make sure to just pick a few from each base rosette and just use that. And you'll be able to identify them by seeing how smooth they are. They have like this sort of paper brown husk around them that you'll be able to wash off very easily, and it has a sort of U or V shape in the actual stem, and you'll see they're nice and plump and juicy. So it grows in sandy areas close to rivers that flood every spring. And you can see in the pictures here, there was a fiddlehead salad that we've made, really nice presentation, feta, almonds, balsamic vinaigrette, bacon, you know. So it was slivers of carrots and stuff. So we do supplement a lot of our foods with garden foods as well as that we grow. I love to make fiddlehead pickles. We've been experimenting with a lot of different crunchy pickle recipes, and it was really awesome to blend different wild spices and ingredients into our pickles. So this one has spruce tips and apple flower blossoms, and I've made some as well with ground sumac and balsamic vinegar, and you can put them in like I said, the salad. You fry them in butter and garlic with a splash of lemon juice. That's what most people do, I find here. Plain Jane cooked over the fire with some fresh brook trout. So that's like one of the wild meals that we actually make in the spring. Is we'll go fishing. We won't bring anything except maybe some bear grease or something to fry them up in or something, and we'll we'll catch some brook trout and we'll pick our fiddleheads, and then we'll have the meal right on that little tiny river beach. So it's one of my most memorable experiences with my kids, and showing them that you can eat completely wild. And don't forget that the stems are just as good. Don't throw them out. I've done a lot of pickles with just the stems, and it's fantastic. So yeah, these are a few ideas you can do with fiddleheads. My second one is stinging nettle. Again, once you find a patch, it's something that there's a lot of it. And it's a really nice wild vegetable and herb, available from June to September. You'll find it in damp, nitrogen-rich soils like farms near a body of water. And they're really high in vitamin A and C, iron, and protein. And a little story of how I actually found nettles. I knew what they were and what they looked like because a friend had given me a transplant, and I transplanted that on my land. But my son, he was having some really big health issues and behavioral issues, and we were like, okay, well, let's get some tests done. So his blood work came back that he was really low in iron. So I'm like, okay, I need to find nettles, please, you know, just give me a sign. Let me know where I can find some nettles. And there was a space that I walked by like 200 times, and I looked down, and I'd never seen anything before there. And I looked down, and there's this little tiny nettle plant. And when I looked around, it was a field of nettles. So excitedly, you know, I picked the top third of the plant. It was in spring as well, so it was nice and lush and fresh. And I came home and I made soup with it, and my son ate 4 bowls right off the bat. And as the weeks went on, he kept eating nettle soup. I'd put it in bread, I'd put it in salt, everything. And he got better, really much better. So I'm really, really thankful for nettles. It really helped him. And I was super grateful that I had found that plant. And it's one of these things where usually the plant will find you when you need it. You know, sometimes you'll go out and you're like, I need to find this plant, and you can't find it. And then all of a sudden, when you're not least expecting it, the plant will find you. So it's one of those things. And you can make some salt with it, like you can see in the picture above. That's one of my wild gourmet salts. And I put the dried leaves and the seeds in them. And that's one of my son's favorite salts. He has it next to his plate every meal. So yeah, he's a huge fan of nettles. You can harvest the top third in spring and summer, and the seeds in the late summer, early fall. It's a big process. It takes a long time, but it's really very beneficial for you. It's one of those plants that is actually one of our abundant local adaptogens. And an adaptogen is a plant that you can use as a tonic to use for a long period of time for stress, for your adrenals, for your energy. And taking like a quarter to half a teaspoon of nettle seeds per day is really, really going to help with your energy. You know, you've walked into a patch of nettles if you get stung and itch like crazy. Cooking, steaming, drying the plant removes the hairs that produce that uncomfortable sting. There's a lot of times when we go swim in the river or something like that, and I didn't plan to wear my gloves or long pants, and I've been stung quite a few times. Now I'm used to it, and I actually really don't mind the buzzing sting. And yes, it does last, you know, for me, it lasts sometimes up to 24 hours, but it was also used as a treatment for arthritis and other issues. So it's not a bad sting. Yes, it's uncomfortable, definitely. But once you get more connected to nettle and stuff and just being around it, using it, you can actually pick it without getting stung. And there's a way of grabbing either underneath the leaf or breaking off the top stem. And you can actually even take a leaf, roll it through your fingers, break up those little stings, and then pop it in your mouth. So that's one of the little challenges that we give ourselves and students that we teach. You can also use the young stems in your cooking. So you can put it in stir fries, the leaves and the stems. In bannock. So bannock is a simple bread that uses about 4 or 5 ingredients. We cook a lot of it either over the fire like that you can see in the photo, or just in dough rolled around a stick and then cooked over the fire. So that's one of the favorite things that my kids love to do in the woods. And what I do to put it in bread, very easy, is just steam the plant, chop it up, and then add it to my bread batter and then put that in. So it's really cool. It's really good in finishing salts like that I showed you, in soups and in pesto. So you can see that down below, the pesto is made with lamb's quarters, which I'll talk about soon, and nettle. So we do a lot of that. I've done a lot of nettle and fireweed tops pestos as well for that extra antioxidant boost. So we'll talk about that later. So Japanese knotweed is one of the pretty much like the most invasive plant that you don't have to be afraid of putting a big dent into the stand of knotweed. It's so invasive that you can eat as much as you want, either raw or cooked. So it's very high in vitamin C as well, and grows in disturbed spaces near farms on the sides of the roads. Like I said, take a drive out to Caparagé in New Brunswick, you'll see it everywhere. There's like 50 stands just in that little road. It does absorb toxins, so be sure to harvest in clean areas. So not on the side of the road in Caparagé, unless it's like further into land or something, and you have permission to go. You can harvest it in the spring. The young shoots are perfect for recipes, and as you can see, it's very juicy and hollow inside, and there is some juice that also runs in that, so my kids love to cut it off and then drink the juice. It tastes like rhubarb and has like a lemony green taste. You can replace rhubarb in recipes or cook as you would asparagus. Because it is kind of like rhubarb as well, it does get mushy quick. So if you're cooking them up like asparagus, well, pretty much like asparagus, that's what it does too. It gets really mushy if you cook it for a long time. Just be sure to not cook it as long if that's what the consistency that you want. Can replace rhubarb in recipes. Absolutely fantastic as a crunchy pickle. So as you can see in the picture down there, I made Japanese knotweed pickles with fresh ginger, hot peppers from my garden, and garlic. And it was awesome, just adding that. You can also make salsa with it. So a few years ago, I gave a presentation on 3 wild foods, and the Japanese knotweed was one of them. So we made a knotweed salsa, and you can also make jams and jellies with them. So as you can see in that picture there, I put some fresh strawberries that I had picked locally and some knotweed, and it was just like a rhubarb strawberry jam. So yeah, very, very good. So this one, it's actually one of the first ones when I really got serious about foraging that I really connected with. And fireweed, you'll find, well, you can see the picture right there with the pink, purple flowers. So usually you'll see them in late summer, fall, July, they'll start, popping up these flowers. And so take a note of where you see these flowers grow, because in the spring, when you're trying to find it and identify it, it's a lot harder. So if you find a stand in July, August, sometimes September, note where it is and then come back in the spring, and then you'll see the shoots. So in that photo above, we can see the shoots coming out, and you really want the juicy stems. Some of them are spindly and dry, and you don't want that. You want the nice juicy ones, because that too is like a wild asparagus, and the tops are really good as well, added to things. So you can find them in fields, disturbed soils, and recently burned areas on the sides of roads. And that's what's interesting about fireweed. It's actually one of the first plants that comes back after a fire, and the rhizomes will help settle the land. So there's less risk of landslides and things like that. So the rhizomes are the roots system that's just going to go and get right into there and settle the land, so it's more stable. Very high in vitamin A and C and antioxidants, as I mentioned. You can use the young shoots in the spring, the leaves in the summer before flowering, and the flowers when they flower. Can be used as a substitute for asparagus. So you would cook them just like you would asparagus. Sometimes I'll just fry them up in a pan with some oil, some garlic, a bit of lemon juice, just like you would fiddleheads. And one thing I wanted to actually add with all of these foods, we're going to share recipes on social media and things like that, so be sure to follow. But these foods, I want you to be adventurous in your cooking. Once you've identified them at 100%, I want you to be adventurous and try things that are different. Just incorporate them in your cooking. Just greens, just fry them up or steam them, add them to breads and things like that. So don't be afraid to supplement those wild foods into your regular diet. They're really cool in pickles. So I've made pickles with them with just a young shoot with a bit of the leaves on top, the coriander that I grew from my cilantro in the garden, some lemon and some garlic. And you just do a little simple vinegar, half and half water vinegar. I like apple cider vinegar with some spices. Boil the vinegar concoction, add to your sterilized jar with your vegetables, and then seal it up. And this is a way of making pickles that are actually crunchy. So they're not just quick pickles, they actually do seal. So it's really fun to experiment with some wild foods and then putting them in jars and making pickles. Leaves can be added to salads and in salad dressings, in pesto as well, flowers and desserts, and you can add them to, you can make a jam or jelly. So I'm sure you've heard of fireweed jelly. Really, really good. This year I was very happy to have my 18-year-old experiment with wild jams and jellies, and she did wild violet jellies, dandelion jellies, fireweed jellies, and so that was fun, especially in confinement when they could find a new thing to work on, a new hobby. That was awesome. Leaves can also be fermented to make Ivan or Russian tea. So it's a type of just a fermented tea or an oxidized tea, like they would do green and black tea, where you pick the leaves before it flowers, and then you'll let them wilt for about 24 hours. And then you will take them about 5 or 6 in your hand, and then roll them in little balls and add them to either a plastic bag or in a sort of casserole dish or something like that. And then you'll let them wilt and ferment for about 3 days. Once they've fermented this way or broken down, oxidized, then you will dehydrate them on low for until they're nice and dry. And the longer the fireweed leaves, the tea is sitting in the jar in a cupboard or something, the better it'll be. So if you're making a tea with just the fireweed leaves, you'll notice that, yes, it's astringent and a bit bitter, and it's all right, but it's not like making a true tea like I'm explaining here. The more time goes on, the more flowery it becomes. And it's actually one of my husband's favorite teas, and he used to think that tea is just dirty water. So for us, he actually went out last summer alone, and he picked as much as he could to store for the winter because he loves it that much. So that was great. The young shoots and leaves can be added to your wild kimchi as well. So usually my husband will make like just a regular traditional kimchi, and right next to him I'll be making a wild kimchi with young dandelion leaves, goldenrod leaves, fireweed leaves and stems, things like that. So there's tons of things that you can do with this wild food. All right, lamb's quarters. So lamb's quarters is a very, very fast growing plant, a volunteer that grows wild in gardens and nutrient-rich soils like compost piles. And I'm sure you've seen this before because it's a weed that we pull out in our gardens all the time. Okay, so it's something that I love to munch on when I'm actually weeding my garden. And what I'll do every year is leave a space that's wild in my actual garden so I can harvest the weeds that grow there as well. It's also known as goosefoot, pigweed, and wild spinach. They pack a seriously nutritional punch, so really high in vitamin A, C, E, and K, and is actually a close cousin to the quinoa. So that was really interesting when we found that out a few years ago. The seeds are harvested when they turn a pink-red color. So you can see a picture here where there's the seeds, but they're nice and green. I still add them to my cooking, but if I wanted to keep them for as a grain or as a coffee substitute, I'll wait till they turn a pink-red color and then I'll harvest them, dry them, and then grind them into a flour or roast as a coffee substitute, or eaten as a grain, or topped on your oatmeal in the morning, things like that. Harvest the top third of the plant from June to July. Unless during the summer you're still weeding your garden and you see new ones pop out, by all means eat it. I do a lot of anything that spinach is called in recipe, I'll add lamb's quarters instead. You can add it to your wild salads and vinaigrettes. So as you can see in the picture there, on the top we have a salad that is completely wild. We had a challenge a few years ago when I went back home in Ontario where we're like, okay, we're going to make a completely wild meal. So we caught a lot of smallmouth bass and we seasoned them with spruce needles. And for the salad, we had lamb's quarters, pineapple weed, red clover, veg flowers, chickweed, and bedstraw. So that was one of the really cool salads that my kids actually put together. And the vinaigrette, we did, I love, there's another plant that's called sheep sorrel. It's like a lemony plant that grows in grass and in gardens and things like that. And it's very lemony, and some people call them sweeties. When we were kids, we always used to look in the grass for these lemony sour leaves. So I put that, I put fresh dandelion leaves, some goldenrod, some lamb's quarter, and I'll do some apple cider vinegar, some olive oil, salt and pepper, and I always add some local maple syrup because it's really, really good. And I'll add that to my wild salads. And then the one next to the other one is lamb's quarters, Caesar, romaine hearts with fresh strawberries, feta, nuts. So yeah, that was really good. The plant contains oxalates. It's an acid that is also found in spinach and rhubarb, Swiss chard, and potatoes. So cooking and freezing it breaks down this acid. If you're very sensitive to oxalates, then just be careful. Or you have, you're prone to kidney stones or things like that. Just go lightly on it, just as you would the other foods that contain oxalates. But usually breaking it down, cooking it, it helps. So goose tongue greens. This is another one, especially in the Maritimes, that is super popular, and it's a staple wild food here in the Maritimes. It's flat in fat, and it's a green that grows in bunches in salt marshes. Very high in vitamins A, C, K, and potassium, and it's actually related to the plantain, Plantago major. This plant, the Latin name is Plantago maritima. And it has some of the same properties. So just a little side note, if you're in the marshes and you get cut or stung, or just make a spit poultice with this plant, and I've done this often with my kids, I'll take goose tongue green, chew it up, and then put it on the wound to help to stop the bleeding, infection, and to have a cleaner wound once we get home. Don't confuse the two with poisonous arrowgrass. Arrowgrass grows in the same type of environment, but you'll know when you found goose tongue greens. They grow in clumps just like arrowgrass, but arrowgrass is more tubular, very thin, and actually hollow in the middle. So just compare the two before ingesting. The goose tongue greens can be eaten raw or cooked. They're salty, crunchy, and keeps its form really well in cooking. And traditionally, they are added to pork shoulder roasts and potatoes. So that's what most people that I know here, that's what they do. And they also salt them for year-round access to goose tongue greens. I prefer to make a miso type seaweed salad with it. And I've been working on this recipe for a long time. And I'm like, I wanted something, it's not common for us to be buying seaweeds, like it will harvest seaweed, but I really liked using goose tongue greens as a seaweed alternative. So I'll steam it or I'll boil it, and then I'll season it and I'll toss it in a miso vinaigrette. So you can see in the picture there's a goose tongue green miso seaweed salad with cattail, inner core, and chive blossoms. And there's also that trout, the japonica rice, and then topped with chickweed and cattail core that actually has that cucumber-like taste. So a really good alternative to seaweed if you don't have access to it. So that's it for goose tongue greens. So for our 6 plants, if we go back to fiddleheads, I didn't mention this because it's usually common knowledge here, but you do have to boil the fiddleheads about 7, 8, 10 minutes, and then you rinse, and then you can fry up or steam them again or things like that, just to get rid of the toxins. So that's one of the important things. The other ones usually can be used raw or cooked, so no worries about that. So for my 6 plants, that's what I have. I really wanted to focus on these 6 abundant plants so that they are easier to find and they are easy to incorporate in your regular diet. So don't be afraid to experiment, all right? And just to go back on the ethics of the forager, Tatum had some really good points. I just put together a few things. Like she said, harvest only what you need. You're not going to be, picking buckets and then realizing you don't have time to harvest them, and then they'll sit and they'll spoil. So let's not do that. Protected species are off limits. know your at-risk species, and like she said, see United Plant Savers. And just like the example that she gave about eyebright, for us, it's very, very prolific. In other parts of the world, it isn't. So use your judgment and do some research before. The 1 in 20 rule: harvest where there are over 20 plants to maintain the population. So you're not going to go out and grab the first plant that you find, all right? And take a moment or months or even years to just sit with a plant and really get to know it. It's not all about, I need to go forage and I need to feed myself and that's what it is. No, you need to really connect with the land in a way that you're open to the suggestions that these plant allies have for you, and you build that relationship and you build that experience with the plants. Leave the biggest and best plants so they can continue to grow the healthiest population, and honor the animals that live and feed on these plants as well. Leave 2/3 of the plant population, and that includes chaga, but not wild mushrooms. And I didn't get into wild mushroom because that is a whole other wild food category that is a lot more complicated, because there are millions of types of mushrooms. But when I say that includes chaga but not wild mushrooms, you don't have to be afraid of picking the mushrooms that you find, because cutting it, pulling it, it won't affect the population. And actually harvesting mushrooms will help with delivering the spores of those mushrooms on the forest floor. And there are mycelium colonies underneath the ground that make sure to keep having mushrooms pop up. But for chaga, if you pick it, leave 2/3 of it on the tree. Let's be sustainable about it. Bring a gift, a song, an offering to thank the plants for their gift of food or medicine. They are giving us something that is completely free, but there has to be that mutual respect. And I know it's crazy for people to think, well, a plant doesn't have a respect for humans kind of thing. It's a whole nother realm. But just to be able to, with a humble heart, be able to honor these plants and these gifts, it's just good practice. Harvest away from polluted areas and 50 feet from roads. That's self-explanatory. One important thing is, if a friend or a forager or a teacher brings you to their secret harvesting spot, don't go back without their permission. It's called respect. And we have had relationships really get spoiled because some people went back and harvested everything. So let's respect the forager and respect your friend. Bring your kids with you. Teach them to be self-reliant in nature. One of the best things about parenting for me has been to actually get my kids outside, get them away from electronics. And I really have an internal problem with this use of electronics so much, and I've been fighting it for years. But getting them outside and getting them interested in what grows around them and how they can actually go outside and pick a wild meal and supplement their diet, and they are proud that they actually contributed to the meal, is awesome. It's really awesome. And the number one rule: never put anything in your mouth unless you're 100% sure it is safe to eat. So just make sure you know, and know your toxic lookalikes, like water hemlock, poison hemlock. So yeah, be sure to know your foods before you put them in your mouth. Most importantly, have fun. There's nothing better than eating wild and bringing your bounty home to eat and share with your loved ones. It's one of the best things ever that we've been able to do. And just to even create a wild meal and have friends over when we could before COVID, and have a barbecue or have it's one of my most prized memories of living here. Just some wild meal ideas that we do put together, and how easy it is to incorporate. We've got a seafood linguine with homemade chanterelle and lobster mushrooms, the garden squash tort with homemade honeymead spelt crust stuffed with lamb's quarter, dandelion greens, cream cheese, the wild lobster mushroom stuffed garden yellow squash with tons of garden vegetables, which was really awesome, and the kids really enjoyed that one. and the bear roast with garden peas, green beans, potatoes, topped with chanterelle mushrooms, and a blueberry and blackberry coulis. So that was one of my favorite meals to honor the harvest and the bear that my husband was lucky enough to get. So yeah, so for that, those are just ideas, and there you go, connect with us. We share tons of things on connecting with the wild and foods and our journeys. So it was awesome being able to present to you guys. And that's the end of my presentation.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Geneviève. That was awesome. So we will get to the questions in the chat box here now.
Thank you.
There was one about little heads and which ones should people harvest. I know some people don't know how to identify the right ferns. So Geneviève, do you have any tips on how to do that?
So the ostrich fern, the one that you want to harvest, has a smooth skin, has a V or U shape inside the stem. The fronds will pop up and you'll have like a papery thin brown husk that you can just rinse off. The ones that we don't want to harvest, and it's easier to see that when you harvest the real thing, you'll definitely be okay. This is the ones that you find in the woods that are not growing near sandy rivers that flood. They'll be hairy, they'll either have black hairs or white hairs, and they'll be all covered in hairs, and they're really small compared to regular fiddleheads. So that's one way of identifying them.
So the hairy ones are not the ones we want.
Right.
Okay.
Recipes for pickled fiddlehead, someone's asking.
Yeah, so if you're doing the method of, let's say, quick pickles or making a regular batch of pickles, you'll usually have like half water and half vinegar. And the way that you're gonna make a pickle is you'll sterilize all your jars, you'll stuff your fiddleheads. You can steam them before or boil them before a little bit to get those toxins out. And then you'll stuff your jars with your spices, any type of spice, experiment, have fun with it, then your fiddleheads. And then you'll do a half and half water and apple cider vinegar. And then you'll boil that for 5 minutes with more spices if you like. And then you'll top all the way to the top your fiddleheads in your jar, cap them, put them upside down, and then they'll seal and they're good. So, and I like to wait like a few weeks for all the spices to really marinate together before eating them. So right now my fridge is full. I have about 8 or 10 different wild pickles in there, including daisy capers, including stem pickles. I have a picture actually, stem pickles over here, you can see. And these are the stem of the actual fiddlehead. I didn't want to waste them, and I put balsamic and garlic and wild sumac, which is a Lebanese wild spice as well, and I added that to the pickles, and it's great. So very easy to make crunchy, fast pickles.
Awesome. Pauline and Emmanuel are asking, can you help identify nettles? I thought I had some, but it does not look like that.
So the leaves are opposite. So you'll have 2 leaves like this, and then 2 leaves like this, and 2 leaves like this. And they are slightly fuzzy or hairy because those are the little type of needles that will get you stung. Sometimes, actually most of the times when I find nettles, there's jewelweed, which is another wild plant that grows right next to it. And jewelweed is actually the antidote for the sting. The juice of the plant, you'll just crush it in your hands and then put it on your stings, and it'll help get rid of the sting. Hope that helps.
Awesome. Now, a Booktush Farmers Market is asking, can you freeze the leaves, steam first?
Yep. Definitely you can do that. Actually, that's what I do with most of my harvest. I will harvest my tops, my top third of the plant. I'll chop them up with the stem. I'll steam them for about a minute. I'll get them to squeeze the water out, and then I'll put them either in ice cube trays or just in little baggies, and I'll pop them in the freezer. And when I want to use them in breads or soups or things like that, I'll just take it out, chop it up, and then add to my recipe. So that's one of the best ways of actually preserving nettles if you have access to a freezer. You can also use them just in oil. So you would get your mason jar and then take your nettles, let them wilt for about 24 hours and chop them up, put in your jar, top with oil and whatever spice you want, and then let them macerate for a few weeks, but you can pop them right into the fridge. And then when you want that nice nettled taste or add to recipes, just take a few leaves from your oil infusion and eat them with your cooking.
José Bourrier is saying, ça pousse dans le nord de l'Ontario?
Yes, it does. Nettles, you mean, or fiddleheads? Well, actually, all the plants except the goose tongue greens grow in northern Ontario as well. So there's a lot of these plants. It's actually the boreal forest that we have all over Canada, and most of these plants grow in this type of region.
Okay, and what else do we have here? Anyone else hungry and thinks that Geneviève should open a wild food grocery store?
Actually, the plan in all of these years was to. Well, I'm working on a cookbook right now, but it's important for me for people to realize that there's so much wild food out there, and we can be a lot more resourceful. And the goal is to share as much wild food as we can, and also the food security is incredibly important, as we all know, and that's what we're all working towards. Food security, biodiversity, respecting our ecosystems, and being able to actively participate in the growth of our own food in New Brunswick and elsewhere. And so knowing the wild foods that you can incorporate into your diet, they're the most nutritious thing out there. They are better even than organic, hydroponics, whatever. So your food pantry is right out there. And a lot of these plants also are medicinal. So it's just to get into it and just start learning.
Awesome. Sophie Offrey is asking, can you remind me how to differentiate goose tongue and arrowgrass, please?
So goose tongue, it grows in clumps just like arrowgrass. The thing is with goose tongue is that it's flatter, it's juicier, and it's not as tall. Arrowgrass grows taller, and it's actually hollow and a darker green, and it tastes like crap. So don't taste it, but you know, a lot of things with foragers, that's how we remember the taste of food, or the energetics of a plant, is that taste and then spit out. I wouldn't recommend that for beginning foragers, but a lot of them, what we do that. So arrowgrass, very tall, spindly, hollow. Goose tongue, very flat, not as tall, can get really thick though. And you would harvest them in June, early July, and not later on, because they do get very bitter. They get brown red kind of thing. So
cool, thank you. And our last question is from Booktush Farmers Market, and they're saying, what about your personalized walking tour of the owner's property? Mention it.
So what we do is we offer personalized private tours for anybody who wants to discover the plants that are on their land and what they can eat and what they can use medicinally. So we do offer that option for people who either don't want to join in or walk with a bunch of people, or because of COVID and we don't want to have a bunch of people walking. And it's $250 for 3 hours, and you get a personalized list of the plants that we found on your land, and a few tips and tricks on how to incorporate them in your food and medicine, as well as books and things that you can deepen your knowledge with. So yeah, that's one of the things that we do offer.